I'm Mark Canuel. I'm director of the Institute for the Humanities. And I'd like to welcome you to our annual Visiting Fellow lecture on Zoom. Joining us today are Surya Parekh, who will be assisting, and Gayatri Spivak, who is our visiting fellow. The seminar with Professor Spivak is tomorrow at 3 p.m. I'd first of all like to thank Linda Vavra, our Associate Director, for helping out with every aspect of this event, and also our valiant graduate students, Dan Majors and Tierney Powell, for helping with everything from advertising to our web presence. And Jeff Warner is handling our production for the event. This event, like all of our activities, is free and open to the public. And so in order to do that, we are supported by the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and we're always so grateful for their support. And certainly we are grateful for our audience as well. We know that we definitely don't take for granted the fact that people join us for academic community and intellectual exchange in these times of empirical disconnection. You can type questions into chat after the talk is over, or if they come to you during the talk, you can certainly do that, either chat or Q&A. If you would like to see a live transcript, you can click the button at the bottom of your screen to see that. And if you have any other accessibility needs, you can message me directly and we'll see what we can do about it. We do have a couple of upcoming events at the Institute. On April 20th, Jan Robert will be doing our final faculty fellow lecture. We also have a Humanities Day on April 28th with a number of events, and you can find out more about these by visiting our Facebook page or visiting us on social media, and I hope you'll follow us in those various venues. I'm first going to introduce Surya Parekh, who will be assisting Professor Spivak today. Surya is Assistant Professor of English at Binghamton University. He received his BA from Ohio State and his PhD from UC Santa Cruz, followed by fellowships at Monash University and Penn State University. He's co-editor of the forthcoming volume, Spivak Today. He has written and spoken widely on the subjects of Black politics, philosophy, literature, and history. His book, Black Enlightenment, is eagerly awaited and currently under consideration. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Gayatri Spivak, University Professor at Columbia University and a founding member of its Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. And although many people may feel that she doesn't need an introduction, this can often be precisely the reason why we need one to remind ourselves of the multiple facets of a scholar whose work we think we know. I don't believe it was just serendipity that in a couple of different academic contexts very recently outside UIC in the past month or so, Professor Spivak's work came up in conversation about the theories that are currently animating our work in the humanities by both graduate students and faculty members. And I wondered why even some of Professor Spivak's essays written 40 years ago continue to be so vital at our moment. Or perhaps it's more relevant than just the moment, perhaps the last 4 years, perhaps the last 10, or maybe we have never really stopped engaging with the work of this scholar who is unceasingly engaged herself in the commitment to combine the most rigorous critical powers with the most generous ethos of understanding. Professor Spivak studied at the University of Calcutta and Cornell, and first taught at the University of Iowa, the University of Pittsburgh, and the University of Texas at Austin before joining the faculty at Columbia. Her very close ties to India, I should mention, resonate throughout her academic work and in her foundation to support schools for adults and children in Bengal. She maintains an intimate and ongoing involvement with these schools. When I was an undergraduate at Williams College, among a small group of books that you could pretty much be guaranteed to find on any intellectually curious person's bookshelf were Derrida's Of Grammatology and Gayatri Spivak's In Other Worlds, Essays in Cultural Politics. I can't guarantee that we understood all of this, but we tried. The first was translated by Professor Spivak with what she later called a humble introduction. But that humble 90-page introduction ambitiously positioned Derrida in the history of Western philosophy and helped put him on the map for English-speaking readers. The second of these books, In Other Worlds, actually her second monograph after a book on Yeats, articulated the crucial conjunctions among Marxism, feminism, and deconstruction in a global context. And these conjunctions have defined her career, even as the arguments informed by them have evolved over time. In Other Worlds contained an essay entitled Sex and History in the Prelude, an essay particularly important to me in that it so adventurously read Wordsworth's famous poem as an aggressive avoidance of paternity and dependence and an assertion of androgynous selfhood in relation to his actual paternity and dependence upon the mediating power of women who appear as traces throughout the poem. At that time, even deconstructive practices of reading hallowed the works they dismantled with a certain kind of awe. But Spivak's approach was distinctive in its bold approach toward the most canonical of writings in order to account for its power as much as its disavowals. And it accompanies other essays in that collection that work sympathetically in at least two complementary directions, honing a sharpened political criticism that challenges national imperial logics and focusing attention on writings and voices from French feminism to the work of Mahaswita Devi that motivate such a challenge. The impressive number of humanities reorienting interventions exceeds the space of any introduction. Her essays, Subaltern Studies, Deconstructing Historiography, Three Women's Texts and a Critique of Imperialism, or Speculations on Reading Marx After Reading Derrida, are instances of works that are not just classics and being honored over time. More important, they've helped generations of scholars to situate their work and inspired so many of our students and early career scholars to continue challenging traditional fields in the humanities, reshaping them by acknowledging their silent others and constitutive exclusions. In our recent efforts to decolonize various disciplines, we feel like this is a renewed urgency of Spivak's polemics. Perhaps standing out among all of these texts is her 1988 essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, reprinted in countless anthologies and revised and incorporated into her Critique of Postcolonial Reason. Here, Professor Spivak sought to identify the right tools for grasping the subaltern predicament. A critique of Deleuze and Foucault in their generalizations of Western subjectivity, it critically mobilized tools of deconstruction to expose the persistent otherness of subalternity. It urged a way of analyzing decolonized space as both an incitement to and resistance to codified legal and philosophical definition. The reception of this essay demonstrates crucial aspects of Professor Spivak's work, its unsettled and unsettling labor to find theoretical tools adequate to the analysis of empire and its legacies along the axes of race, class, and gender have made it influential for critics across a range of humanistic disciplines. Her work continues to engage in a reciprocal effort to reach out to new crossings and combinations of theoretical models in order to expand the horizon of analytical powers. No practice, she says in an interview with Elizabeth Gross, takes place without presupposing itself as an example of some more or less powerful theory. By powerful, I think she means capacious and precise. The commitment is amply on display in a critique of postcolonial reason. This is as coherent and incisive an account of the interdependence of empire and the Western philosophical tradition as can be found anywhere. While the encounter with subalternity requires reoriented powers of critique, Professor Spivak's point about the interweaving of theory and practice requires attentively reorienting our disciplines to new horizons. In Death of a Discipline, for instance, she defends a re-energized comparativism that moves beyond the reified divisions of area studies to address cultural production globally with attention to cultural and linguistic specificity and difference. And an entire world of readers can now be grateful for the series of Professor Spivak's translations of Mahasweta Devi that have brought her writing increasing attention among English-speaking readers. Translation for Spivak is not only an academic commitment, but also an ethical and political one, which she has explored with writing on the politics of translation with an academic career committed to the practice of translation. Now, I know I'm taking way too long with this introduction already, but I want to mention just one more aspect of Professor Spivak's work that connects to the issues of translation and comparativism. And that's the evidence of the intellectual friendships that persist across her writing and so many interviews. Open the work of Professor Spivak and you'll see what I'm talking about. Acknowledgements of and anecdotes about far-flung students, interlocutors, colleagues, mentors, mentees, so many names to name, all of them friends in the process of intellectual pursuit and conversation. It's been a pleasure of mine to have conversations leading up to this much anticipated event. And I thank Professor Spivak for bearing with us during this long time preparing for the event. And I'm pleased to continue that conversation by handing the mic over to Professor Gayatri Spivak to speak to us on learning from mistakes, how a Marxist feminist deconstructivist confronts the paradox of democracy. Thank you, Professor Spivak.
Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me? My voice is coming through? Great. Really such a generous introduction. I like long introductions because it calms me down. They calm me down. I'm very, very calm. Thanks a lot. And Linda, I don't know how to thank you. Linda has made my life comfortable for the many months that we have spent, both Mark and I, quite excited about now this evening. Well, for me, of course, and so it is for you. It's a dull evening in New York. I don't know how it is in Chicago, but I'm very glad that you all came. I don't really know how to thank old Surya, but I mean, he doesn't really assist me. He's so involved with everything I do. And I think somewhat I am with what he does, that everything has to be done together. Well, here I go. In fact, what Mark was saying about the prelude, the essay on the prelude, I'll repeat some of those things. Anyway, I was 45 years old when In Other Worlds came out. Of course, the author of the book, in the prime of her life, looking forward to a future, objected to the tripartite description, quote, imposed, I thought wrongly, upon me by Colin McCabe in his foreword to the book. The better known person, my self-selected brilliant editor William Germano selected, as the introducer so that people would buy the book. Today, 35 years later, I feel that it was not wrong to describe me in that way. If Colin had been able to access my Bengali side, the three labels would have applied. At least that is my mature opinion, not necessarily to be trusted, of course. So anyway, you can call this an essay in reparation to Colin McCabe's generosity, an account of the progress of the working life of the 45-year-old Marxist feminist deconstructivist. It's a, I'm at the end of my life and I'm giving a kind of life in progress as it happened. Mark Canwell's favorite piece, Sex and History in the Prelude, 1805, books 9 to 13. I hadn't looked at it forever. It was fun reading it. I mean, it was just, and I told my physical therapist that I was having fun reading something I wrote many years ago. And she said, "What's it on?" I said, "Wordsworth." I said, "What?" And she says, "What's that?" I mean, imagine she has a doctorate in physical therapy and she's a smart person in the United States today with education as it is. An educated person can ask me, "What's that?" with Wordsworth. Bear that in mind. So it fits the starting point, for the piece is a recasting in deconstruction of a paper I wrote for M.H. Abrams in my first semester at Cornell in 1961. I think it gives you a sense of how my professors at Presidency College, Calcutta, Taraknath Sen and Amol Bhattacharjee in particular, taught me to read poetry because I've come, I mean, it's the first semester, right? As stagings of desire rather than accounts of desire's fulfillments. And I was, bold girl. I was 19 years old in 1961. And so I will, in fact, cite what Mark has already referred to. I have not asked the critic to be hostile to poetry or to doubt the public school face, although I have asked her to examine the unquestioning reverence, or on the part of the poets themselves, the credulous vanity that seems to be our disciplinary requirement. So this is the first generation. Presidency College is an extremely critical college. And it's the first real generation post-colonial coming up studying English. We were really like that generation. It's something to be thought about, and you hear the boldness. That's where we were. It's the voice of a generation. I write with the boldness of the smart and very young student. I am 19 that semester. Marx, I pointed out, had defined the revolutionary as the successful learner of a foreign language. You know the passage in 18 Brumaire. The successful learner of a foreign language who had made it their own. Revolution is not natural. And if there's anybody from Assam, oh my goodness me, please hang up. I'm in Zoom. This can't be shut off. But okay, so if there's anybody from Assam here, I would like them to think of the novel Rupabari Polash, where Syed Malik says that he has made Assamese his own. This way of really forgetting one's mother tongue, or even Rushd translating Aristotle, forgetting your mother tongue and making the so-called foreign language your own. Marx finds this as a model for revolution. Wordsworth, I insist, and I quote myself, engages in a bizarre retranslation into the old, even as a new and unknown language is thrust upon him by the French Revolution. Wordsworth's securing of the imagination is disclosed fully through a gendered narrative, Mark has noticed this, implicit in the extraordinary poem. This bit is what I later learned to call affirmative sabotage. for the, you have to really love the thing that you're talking about. And the prelude, in my mind, is still an unbelievable poem. For the content of this gender analysis did not come from Presidency College or Abrams. Indeed, the latter would not have survived Me Too. When a man, I write, here Wordsworth, addresses another man, Coleridge, in a sustained conversation on a seemingly universal topic, we must learn to read the microstructural burden of the woman's part, is what I wrote. You will judge if in the reading I keep to this task, but this is what connects this very early piece to the recent reading of Pterodactyl, Mahasweta Devi's novella of that name, that I include at the end today, where I not only learn, as I say here, but attempt to stage a learning from mistakes, not in this early bold piece. No mistakes here. You know what you're talking about. First generation feminist. No, actually, my mother was a very strong feminist indeed. So this kind of itinerary, as from a reading of the prelude to that of the pterodactyl, can be performed with other early late couplings. To cite one more, a coupling of the letter as cutting edge, which is in this book, and willing suspension of disbelief, here, now, both on Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, the second calling out the mistakes made in the first, and staging a breakdown, trying to learn from them. At this stage, deconstruction is learned well. As I'm staging it, it's learned. And the deconstructive excuse is made right at the start. According to the trace structure, there can be no beginning, and yet I begin. It's a classic deconstructive maneuver. This is my first book after the appearance of the English grammatology. My Marxism, now I begin to step into the moves, my Marxism changed through the years into an epistemological reading. It is well known that in Capital One, Marx asks the implied reader, the factory worker, to change his or her self-representation from victim to agent of production. People know this is nothing new here. Only this could lead to claiming surplus value and its socialist use, an idealist hope, in Marx's case, by a materialist. Antonio Gramsci puts it thus in Prison Notebook 10. I quote, "The proposition contained in the preface to a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, to the effect that men acquire consciousness of structural conflicts on the level of ideologies, should be considered as an affirmation of gnosiological and not simply psychological and moral value. Gnosiological, in the logic of gnosis, knowing, a word fragment that is still in colloquial English use, diagnosis, prognosis, words related to healing or the impossibility of healing, the double bind of healing. Quintin Hoare and Jeffrey Noel Smith translate Gramsci's gnosiological as epistemological. Actually, between gnosiological and epistemological, there is no difference, writes the Italian political philosopher Michele Spanò. Yet they are two different words. Therefore, their so-called identity is a heterotautology. There is a difference between them, although they're the same. In this difference as identity of a smooth translation, I will place the globalizability of Marx today. Gnosiological, learn to talk the talk well. Epistemological, learn to reimagine myself as knower and the object of knowing as knowable in order to try to walk the walk, not just talk the talk well. Failing again and again, brushing yourself off, rising again. This is the new intellectual's task. But Marx says it of proletarian revolutions. Very well-known passage. I quote again. They return, Marx writes, to to what has apparently already been accomplished in order to begin from the beginning again. With merciless thoroughness, they mock the half measures, the weaknesses, and wretchednesses of their first attempts. So, this is the model, learning from mistakes, rising again. Gramsci's project became to produce the subaltern intellectual. He emphasized that when the thinker is content with his own thought, I'm sort of quoting, when he's subjectively, that is abstractly free, that is when he today becomes a joke. This is his phrase. The unity of knowledge and life is a master-pupil relationship, one between the philosopher and the cultural environment in which he has to work. So the cultural environment, the subaltern cultural environment is the master, which teaches the teacher who's the disciple. The cultural environment in which he has to work and from which he can draw, learn to learn from below, from which he can draw the necessary problems for formulation and resolution. In other words, writes Gramsci, it is the relationship between philosophy, the wanting to launch this, the whatever it is, the method which is producing the subaltern intellectual, the ideas, and history, that is to say, the actual environment within which this particular case of subalternity is unfolding. Gramsci was not able to learn from his mistakes in the field. He died in prison. As far as my own self-testing goes, as I said at a recent meeting in Britain, as I learn how to make Marxist convictions rather than simply solving their own problems infect their minds, my students, the ones in the rural schools, I see what travels. And the theft of surplus value is one of them. That idea travels, the theft of surplus value. Primitive accumulation, in a broad and minimal definition, the work of the capitalization of land, that is primitive accumulation, no factory needed, the capitalization of land. The work of the capitalization of land, the simplest definition of originary or primitive accumulation, making way for full-fledged industrial capitalism offered by Marx, now with direct access to the world market, also travels to the subaltern voter. That work is not finished. The Amazon forest is, of course, the greatest example, closer to home, accessible to my activist experience, is the example of Ghana, the example of Nigeria, and the rural-urban interfaces, and the agriculture of West Bengal. So that also travels. So this is where my Marxism went, whereas reading Marx after reading Derrida is where it was when I was with the Prelude. If Marx became more epistemological practical, breaking knowing in learning, doing to learn from mistakes, breaking knowing in learning, doing to learn from mistakes, deconstruction thickened into politics and imagination. And I quote Derrida, imagination is the other name of difference as auto-affection. This has to be interpreted, but it's a fantastic definition of imagination. Auto-affection, other name of difference as auto-affection, where the object is supposedly in the self. That's imagination. It thickened in 1997 into planetarity. That's when I launched that idea. If the space of the Kantian transcendental, the Heideggerian Dingen, and Derrida's play of the world, that's one of the things in the grammatology, that the play in the world is located in the play of the world. He thinks this is one of his most important insights. If they are seen as antecedents that this reopening of the book has made me acknowledge after the fact, we can see how powerful this idea of Derrida's, that the play in the world is played by the world. We can see how powerful this can be against the Anthropocene. to remember we are played, not only playing. The extent of Derrida's engagement with the animal that we are or we follow is in this sentence of grammatology. The imagination inscribes the animal in human society, where most would go the other way. Bridge to pterodactyl. I'm quoting, why is it necessary to repeat these warnings? Because the world is being destroyed and saved, and underdevelopment regularly sustained, and its sustainability planned by way of a general confidence in the stability of the concept of digital technoscience. Knowing that these operations are framed in an ignoring of first and last questions might make a world of difference. Another item for the planners of the future. And in part 2 of grammatology, Derrida offers a method for this, which is, I quote, empiricism without guarantees. Empiricism without guarantees. Marxism expands to epistemology and its consequences. Deconstruction thickens into the necessary but impossible politics of planetarity. This is how I'm moving. I now put feminism on hold until I can echo the rhetorical moves of pterodactyl at the end of this talk. And by echo, of course, I mean, and indeed when Derrida says today, our obligation is to echo Plato, it is, of course, the figure of echo, producing truth by taking the last words, whether they are actually following the grammar of our intention. So the production of truth, to an extent, that really is the production of Brahman. As one says, Bhranta Prataraka Vakya. It's Gangesha's idea that there's the deluded, deceived deluder producing truth, saying, trying to deceive, there's a snake in the next room. But hey, there is a snake in the next room. So, you got it. So anyway, that's the way we go. In the late 80s, after 2 miasmatic marriages lasting 21 years, I was able to rediscover that what I wanted most was to be useful. Just before this, through a classed metropolitan identity crisis. Classed metropolitan identity crisis. People come to the United States, and if they're not underclass, they go through this one. I was able to rediscover, through a classed metropolitan identity crisis and a rediscovery of colonialism from a left US position, I had written 2 one-sided finger-pointing works. They're bad, we are good type works. They are very popular. As 3 women's texts and a critique of imperialism, and Can the Subaltern Speak? That period came to an end. They're very careful, serious works. I stand behind them, but that's what they are. That period came to an end with that book called In Other Worlds, whose author could be diagnosed correctly as Marxist feminist deconstructivist, hyphens. And now, with institutional work, when I began to rediscover that I wanted to be useful, with institutional work and activist work coming together, I realized that in the current conjuncture, left and right were bound together. You look at the left in all over the world, they're bound together. They are complicit, as you know, folded together. Since then, I am no longer able to practice anything without acknowledging complicity with the other side. From the period of that change came a collection called Outside In, that's complicity. Outside In the Teaching Machine, which gives me a name for our general predicament today, which we must study without breastbeating in order to forge a stronger, even though more limited practice. Outside In the funding machine, That's where we are today, with where corporatism has gone. There is not much difference between the public sphere and the private sphere. That's complicity. And that's what I began to discover after those two pieces had been written and the marriages disappeared, and I rediscovered that I wanted to be useful. And that one I'm still inside. Deep, diversified, and specific acknowledgements of complicity allowed things to begin. I also began, without marking the spot, to make mistakes from which I would begin to learn painfully as the years unrolled. Now, this was when I also began to think of becoming a servant to the subaltern. Rather, that also continues. From which I would begin to learn painfully as the years unrolled. I could make these kinds of mistakes now because I had the acknowledgement of complicity as a very powerful instrument, not self-defense. So let me enumerate two examples. And I talk to someone, and this will undoubtedly want to happen in the Q&A, and you watch yourself and you stop yourself, because you will realize that this is a very old classroom teacher, just stepped into my 80th year, became an assistant professor in the fall of 1965. That's a very long time, eh? So to an extent, the one thing that shows that you're not learning anything, even if I'm saying something wrong, that you are not learning anything, is when I finish, you begin your answer with no. You understand? That self-defense means you didn't learn anything. You were devising a way of proving me wrong while I was talking. That's where the mind closes. And it's a very nice thing to notice that wanting to happen, and you stop yourself. Okay, let's try there. Let's say yes to her. We don't have to say yes all along. That's acknowledgement of complicity. So the first mistake, so I will enumerate two. The first mistake was the exclusion of enslavement from postcolonial theory. Learning from it requires a narrative. There was a legal emancipation of the enslaved in Guadeloupe in 1848. Guadeloupe, the small Antillean island. Indian indentured laborers were brought for the first time in 1854, packed in a ship called the Aurélie. This first arrival comprised 344 indentured workers. Britain permitted France to buy them, so the emancipation of the enslaved Afro-Caribbeans could be managed. This was a typical imperialist move of dividing subaltern groups under their control, one that transpired all over the colonial dominions, letting ethnic groups be ethnic groups rather than think Africa, that kind of stuff. There's lots of documentation. The first arrival comprised this was a typical imperialist move. The Hindustanis, they were not elite enough to be called Indians. They're called Hindustanis. The Hindustanis came to Guadeloupe. That they would not be trusted by the resident Afro-Caribbeans was a given. On the 150th anniversary of the arrival of the Aurélie, Maryse Condé, an Afro-Caribbean woman seeking to undo the legacy of imperialist bargaining with human flesh, celebrated the arrival of those indentured Hindustanis on her island by arranging a conference she titled Expansion de l'âme. Expansion, the title, Expansion of the Soul, called on the island's Afro-Caribbean and the Indo-Caribbean populations to come together as Guadeloupans to expand their souls. This was an unusual call back then, and it seems even more unusual as history rolls on in other areas of the world where Indians and Africans come together. The competition between India and China to establish new political and economic connections in Africa ignores these earlier colonial histories. I was the only Indian citizen among the people invited by Maurice. And I cannot thank Maurice Condé enough for having given me this life-changing experience. I was able to apologize to these Indians whom we mainlanders had ignored. I sang a song written by our national poet, Rabindranath Tagore, who was a firm believer in creating cultural alliances. The song goes, Jaboi, ami banijjete jaboi, Lokkhire haraboi jodi, Olokkhire paboi. I will surely go trading. If I lose good fortune, I will surely find misfortune.
বাণিজ্যতে যাবই যাবই আমি যাবই ওগো বাণিজ্যতে যাবই যাবই আমি যাবই লক্ষ্মীরে হারাবই যদি অলক্ষ্মীরে পাবই যা
It recalls an earlier dispensation of pre-European trade on the Indian Ocean rim, the other edge of Africa. By the early 20th century, this has changed to a more general invocation of the islands, a more general imagining of the map of trade. The men and women who had crossed the Atlantic in near slavery to just such islands do not appear, not so much forgotten as never acknowledged, even though the poet was aware of indentured labor in Fiji through Dinabandhu Andrews, Charles F. Andrews, and his own secretary, Wilkerson. I skipped my discussion of the song for lack of time. I actually sang each line and explained how we had excluded them. Let me just say that the song concludes with mercantile hope coded in the language of fable. Shatrajar dhanmanik paboi, manik paboi, shetai nami jodi, ami jaboi. I'll get the treasure and jewels of the 7 kings, that's the fable's touch. If I get off there, I'll surely go. The poet is in the trading position, not able to imagine anything like the Aurélie. I offered my running commentary on this song, a song from my own childhood, as an apology to subalternized Indo-Caribbeans on behalf of Indians for the fact that neither the poet nor those of us who have since sung that lovely song had dreamt their compatriots were providing forced labor on such islands. At Exposition de l'Âme, then, Maurice Condé made me rethink the idea that post-colonial criticism need not account for slavery, that India was the jewel in Britain's crown and there was no slavery there. In the late 70s, when I wrote the essay, 3 Women's Texts and a Critique of Imperialism, I did not notice that Mr. Rochester, Jane Eyre's beloved, had been a Jamaican sugar planter and was therefore necessarily a former slave owner, nor that the entire issue of slave trade on purely economic grounds was being bitterly fought in Britain and the Caribbean during those years. I failed to bring the 2 discourses together because of my own historical production. I had at least recognized, and Brent Hayes Edwards points this out to me, at least recognized that the African-American trajectory in the United States was a post-colonial chronicle. Now, Condé was asking me to rethink hybridity as assimilation, as complicity as task, a model for undoing division. She showed Indian complicity in colonial bargaining. She let me see that I too am an upper middle class diasporic after all, taxonomized with the ones I consistently diagnose as innocently claiming identity and thus defeating democracy, a theme I cannot develop here. In Maurice Condé's own words, I quote her, the world in which we live today is one of violence, terrorism, globalization. In that context, she says, one must say farewell to the university before it is too late. I work in that spirit these days, not only as a professor, but as an activist who uses book and life for social justice as much as she can, which is not much. As the university corporatizes, and trivializes the humanities and rushes in self-congratulation to catch up with an intersectionality that it can grasp only as class-fixed body count or top-down philanthropy. The Greeks made clear that theorein was not research, but truth staging. I situate Marie Condé as busy with that work. It is hard to follow her in that work. Perhaps I had to wait all this while so that this lesson of complicity for all well-placed diasporics could come forth by way of her constructive invitation. First mistake then. The second, quote, mistake, if you would like to call it that, was to go to my own caste and class to locate the subaltern, Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri, my grandmother's mother's sister, who waited to menstruate before she hanged herself, so that she would leave a message opposing ownership by a male body, my own caste and class. As I was trying to escape complete appropriation by French theory, subaltern studies did not include caste. And my move, I was very surprised to read Randita's wonderful essay to the first volume, no mention of caste. And my move was a, quote, nuanced mistake because I did gender subalternity. Nonetheless, I moved to what Gramsci would call subaltern groups, groups on the margins of history, in 1987. I started to learn how to become the subaltern servant, as I have already said, by responding positively to become a middle-class activist, to respond to a middle-class activist's request to set up 4 elementary schools for the so-called Aboriginal group called the Shobors. Since then, I have made nothing but mistakes, even as I have found ad hoc solutions moving forward. People ask me, what is your method? My answer is, I don't know. My question is how to make the subaltern child inhabit the paradox of democracy. A general answer, if one forgets race, class, caste, gender, tall order, a general answer could be what I said to the European Marxist feminists a couple of years ago, and I quote, let us rethink Marx's intuition of a realm of freedom. You know that wonderful idea where social engineering cannot go, realm of freedom. Let us rethink Marx's intuition of a realm of freedom as the space of the meta-psychological, which can be accessed by a single teacher only hesitantly. Yet that is the space trying to undo the stupid fight between Marxism and psychoanalysis in most quarters. Yet that is the space which we must persistently try dragging into the psychological, drag the meta-psychological into the psychological. That's a description that Marxist feminist theorists would understand of that very way of making mistakes. That's a mistake, isn't it? But I mean, I could really go into Lacan and rational algebra, etc., but no time here. That is the space which we must persistently try dragging into the psychological with a relationship without relationship to the meta-psychological, where we can't go. That's the realm of freedom. That's what the teacher tries to affect. This is cryptic stuff, which we can discuss in the Q&A. Here, suffice it to say that if we think of computing machines, the meta-psychological would represent programming hardware. That's what one needs to affect imaginatively if one is hoping to access cognitive machines. Easy to say, informatics, what it begins in is not meaningful. That's also in Derrida's second chapter. Easy to say, impossible to do, except hesitantly, learning from mistake after mistake. To feel you have succeeded here is to be a fool. This is the whole thing. This is also a hard lesson to learn. People tell me that they're really succeeding at these things. And I feel a little sorry. In 1990, when the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua was approaching its end, Liram Medavoy, Shankar Raman, and Benjamin Robinson published an essay in the Socialist Review called Can the Subaltern Vote? Although the author's concerns were different from mine, their title spelled out half my problem. The intuitions of democracy for the subaltern. The other half being, can the elite vote, which belongs to my Columbia classroom? How one learns to learn from mistakes from the superpower classroom is again something we'll flesh out in discussion. There won't be time. And as I was making these mistakes, I was within the paradox of democracy. Because the basis of our equality in the schools was arithmetic. My only passport is Indian. So each of us with one vote. It's the arithmetic bottom equality of democracy. So I will be going back on the 23rd to vote on the 26th. I have been worrying about the meaningfulness of the words. What is it to vote? Because I was working in Algeria, I learned to say it in Arabic. I learned a little bit of, unfortunately, Maghrebi Arabic, not Fusha. So it's gone as I was kicked out of Algeria in 93. But I would say to the so-called socialist villages of Ben Bella, I would say to the women, what is it to vote? And see what they would say. So I have been worrying about the meaningfulness of the words, what is it to vote, to the subaltern, and had been working on it from the outside, as it were. Now it came to inhabit my teaching at the top and the bottom. And I want to give you a sense of the top and the bottom. So go fast, okay? This is Kakuli Mondal, my teacher in one of these. She's perhaps my best teacher, never. That's another one. And this is a housewarming. Those are some teachers in the front, housewarming at the office building that now is so breaking down that snakes can come in. Okay, go move, yes. This is another housewarming, and this is my, this is another housewarming, Bodhanathpur, and this is my Columbia class. Right, there's Surya again in that corner. So, and of course me. So you can see the top and the bottom, get a sense of it as I talk about it. I'm very good friends with both sides. Democracy operates within the performative contradiction, which Rousseau on down, perhaps Aristotle on down, merits and mathematics, has called a paradox, a performative contradiction. That is to say, simply the clean functioning of the minimum structure of democracy as body count of the arithmetical structure of democracy is not sufficient. The existence of a more fuzzy description of democracy, small d, must coexist, perhaps pre-exist. The second paradox of democracy is that even for the poorest of the poor, it cannot be confined simply to claiming rights for the unjustly disenfranchised. It cannot be just ipseity. If you vote, this is hard to teach to people like my supervisors, teachers, students, etc., who have absolutely no money at all, where even the 3 to 5 year olds are looking after other people's goats and not really cows in order to make a little money. I'm expecting that in the Chicago area there must be many people in the audience who understand Bengali. So it cannot be just ipseity. It must at the same time operate in terms of the equality of others who do not resemble me at all and are not necessarily either good or bad. Democracy is a hospitable form. Therefore, it is almost completely dependent on a very robust, soul-building, humanities-style, persistent education. This is how I came to confront the paradoxes, by discovering complicity and by attempting to learn to be the servant of the subaltern, because I had received privileges historically. I came to the United States. I want to say this very very briefly, because these days I'm being so harassed, especially by envious people at home. As you know, the elite person who went to the United States and who's talking big about people saving the country, etc. As I say, I'm nearly 80 years old. I no longer can just be polite about this. I came to the United States because I had been profoundly critical of the university as editor of the Presidency College magazine. See, it is, and it's really only like 2 or 3 sentences, but they were so strong. It's right there in at the end of this is it. Taruk Babu, my well-meaning professor, looked at this and said, your chances of receiving a first class in your MA are truly jeopardized after making this public in 1960. I'm really brave I was at 18. So I was supporting myself, and though my father was long dead, and in those days with the humanities major, I would not have been able even to ask for a passport if I did not get a first class. Therefore, I borrowed money, life mortgage, because I had no collateral. I came to the United States with $18 in my pocket and not knowing anyone at all, having secured admission on a phone call from Ballygunge Post Office. I mean, my teachers at Cornell used to laugh, saying nobody before or after has ever been admitted like this, so that I didn't take any of the exams. Since I was the best student at university in English honors, and since having borrowed money, I wasn't asking for financial aid, it was cool. In my second year at Cornell, when I was 20, I was not given a teaching assistantship because my native language is not English, because this was 4 years before Lyndon Johnson changed the Alien Registration Act. So it was the things were not the same at that point. They were all quota systems, etc. There was only one Indian, me, in the English department. Can you imagine that today? And so I was not given a teaching assistantship. I had no money, no visa, no work permit, and was about to be deported. So please, to think elite woman comes, gets into the United States, this is a mistake. And when by chance, Paul Deman, the new director of the new program in comparative literature, happened to have filled all his financial aid slots but one, he thought to take a chance rather than lose soft money, and I was launched. And that was really the reason. I asked Paul later, and he said, you're too smart, Gayatri. So he wouldn't tell me a lie. So I just want to say this so that my sense of acknowledging the historical privilege that I have received is related to the caste system than belaboring a story of being in the United States. So I've just quickly told the story. And I never thought worth mentioning all these many years. Please love me. I was not given I was being deported. Oh, give me a break. So, but I am now getting harassed by accusations of elite origins, and I'm close to death. So I decided that I would put out this little bit. Before I conclude with a reading of Pterodactyl, I want to read from 2 pieces on education and citizenship by Tushar Kanjilal and Shankha Ghosh, my 2 Bengali role models. Okay, first Tushar Kanjilal. Here are some shots from my visit to the mangrove swamps in the southern part of West Bengal at his request, where Tushar Kanjilal, this is like, those were the boats that we were using, and you can see it's mangrove, the roots are in water. The mangrove swamps in the southern part of West Bengal, where Tushar established the Tagore Society for Rural Development in 1969. This is ourselves, that's my sister, that's Ratan Johal, and these people, and this is Robin. We are in a garden that Tushar is made. Well, he's dead now, of course. He was planting with all kinds of rare seeds that had really disappeared, and so on and so forth. So we are just sitting there. We had gone together. So certainly the face, should Tushada's picture be? Yes, here's Tushada. What a wonderful face. I adored the guy. Certainly the face of the area has been changed by Tushada's indefatigable work, but he was head teacher at a rural school in the area for many years. And so he wrote as follows about an incident in education at the bottom. I will play myself reading the passage in Bengali simply because I want to give the sense that an elite person, myself, reading a passage by an elite person, Tusharda, still seems subaltern if it is a language from the so-called global south, and some of us don't know it. Go for it.
যাক, দিনুর কাছে শিক্ষাদান ছিল সাধনা। সে বলতো পূজা। দিনুকে শিক্ষক মশাই এবং ছাত্রদের অভিভাবকরা প্রস্তাব দিল তাকে বিদায় সম্বর্ধনা জানানো হবে। সে কি থেকে বিদায় নেবে? বাকি কাজটা করতে আমাকে কে আটকাবে? দিনু এখনো রোজ স্কুলে যায়। কোনো শিক্ষক অনুপস্থিত থাকলে তার ক্লাসের ছাত্রদের নিয়ে তার সাধনাকে চালু রাখে। অনেকে সেটা পছন্দ করে না, কারো বিরুদ্ধে বা পক্ষে তার বক্তব্য নেই। শিশুদের তার কল্পিত একটা সুন্দর সমাজের সুস্থ সবল মানুষ গড়ে তোলার চেষ্টার অভাব তাকে বেদনা দেয়। গ্রামে একটি উচ্চ মাধ্যমিক স্কুল আছে, তার পরিচালন কমিটির নির্বাচন হবে। দুপক্ষই লাঠি সোঁটা বোমা বন্দুক নিয়ে তৈরি। সে পরিবেশে যার মৃত্যু অবধারিত, সেটা শিক্ষা। দিনু পাগলের মতো সেখানে ছুটে গেল। দুপক্ষের মাঝখানে দাঁড়িয়ে সে চিৎকার করে দুপক্ষকেই শান্ত হওয়ার করুণ মিনতি জানালো। সে জানতো না যে এই পরিবর্তিত জগতে শিক্ষা, মানবিকতা, পরস্পরের উপর নির্ভরশীল একটা সমাজ, মনীষীরা মানুষের সুন্দরভাবে বাঁচার যে পথগুলি বাতলে গেছেন, সেদিন ফুরিয়ে গেছে। এখন স্কুল থেকে শুরু করে কেন্দ্রীয়, রাজ্য, সর্বত্র ক্ষমতালোভ মানুষকে তাড়িত করে, এবং সেই তাড়নায় মানুষ বোধহয় অমানুষ হয়ে যায়। ঘন্টা কয়েক পরে যে খবর পেলাম দিনুর মাথায় লাঠি বৃষ্টি হয়েছে, দৌড়ে হাসপাতালের দিকে ছুটলাম। ততক্ষণে দিনুর মৃত্যু ঘটেছে। আমি আত্মায় বিশ্বাস করি না, পরজন্মে বিশ্বাস করি না। দিনুর আত্মার শান্তি কামনা করে কর্তব্য সমাপন করতে ইচ্ছা জাগে না। একটাই কামনা করি, এই মৃত্যু বিফলে যাবে না। শুধু অদূর বা সুদূর ভবিষ্যতে হাজার হাজার নিরস্ত্র দিনু সংঘর্ষকারীদের মাঝে পাঁচিল হয়ে দাঁড়াবে।
So I give the credit. And so with this hope that in the near or distant future, 1,000 unarmed dinus will become a wall between violent polarities, we continue our work of learning from mistakes made in attempting to learn from below how to teach. I should say something here, because rules all of a sudden all around in the last few months have been changed as to how money can move into these schools for payment of the salaries, etc. For 4 months now, these teachers who have nothing at my schools, without my telling them anything, they've been teaching for no money. I was just there and I said to them, look, I can't take the responsibility of making you work for nothing. We're going to make a change actually from next month. But so why don't you folks take a paid leave? I mean, 4 months without salaries. And all of them said on their own that if we stop now, they really will, the kids will, the level of their learning will fall, especially since all primary schools are closed. So you don't have to really think anything about this, but you can give us a vacation if you wish, but we don't think it's proper to take a vacation. So to an extent, what he's describing, this learning from mistakes, something is happening, and I want to mention them. So now Shankho Ghosh, within the tremendous destruction of citizenship in India. Shankho, by the way, I have bad news. I learned today he's 89 years old and he's really quite sick with, advanced Parkinson and so on. I just learned today he has COVID. So, I wrote his daughter saying, please keep me, and she said he was stable. And I do hope that he comes out of it, but it's not good news. Anyway, he's a fantastic poet. Within the tremendous destruction of citizenship in India today, through the deployment of such absurd acts as the Citizenship Amendment Act or instruments such as the National Citizens Register, geared to the Islamophobic goal of constituting India as a Hindu nation that is behind the events in the name of which we work, Shankar Ghosh has written a poem titled Mati or Earth. Its protagonist is not just a victim, but a carrier of the essence of democracy, other people. You will hear it in the line translated, "The world is my guest, Dunia amar mehman," toward the end of the poem. Shankar is a caste Hindu. By line 7, you realize with the word mahfil that he is speaking as a Muslim. And right at the end, bringing in the metaphor of society as a trial by fire, where the protagonist would have to prove a relationship to the earth in open court, your land, you're not a citizen anymore. There is a distinct feminization of the poem's voice as a Muslim Sita on fire trial by Ram, the king of modern India. There is a shal forest in the poem and a mention of the river Ojoy. This is an area where I have been active for a few decades. I show you therefore a selfie, because I can't not show this. I show you therefore, and Shankar laughed and laughed, this is an area, I show you therefore a selfie of the shal forest taken by my supervisor, Dhananjay Lohar, one of those teachers who's teaching for nothing, a Dalit with a high school education, whom on December 29th, as we were traveling from school to school through the forest. And then there is the forest, the shal forest that Shankar mentioned. This is the shal forest. Now the poem.
মাটি আমারই হাতের স্নেহে ফুটেছিল এই গন্ধরাজ, যে কোনো ঘাসের গায়ে আমারই পায়ের স্মৃতি ছিল, আমারই তো পাশে পাশে জেগেছিল অজয়ের জল, আবারও সে নেমে গেছে আমারই চোখের ছোঁয়া নিয়ে। কোণে পড়ে থাকা ওই দালানে দুপুরে ভাঙা থামে আমারই নিঃশ্বাস থেকে কবুতর তুলেছিল স্বর, শালবন পেরোনো এ খোলা মাঠে মাহফিল শেষে নিথর আমারই পাশে শুয়েছিল প্রতিপদে চাঁদ। তোমাদের পায়ে পায়ে আমারও জড়ানো ছিল পা, তোমরা জানোনি তাকে, ফিরেও চাওনি তার দিকে। দুধারে তাকিয়ে দেখো ভেঙে আছে সবগুলি সাঁকো, কোনখানে যাবো আর যদি আজ চলে যেতে বলো। গোধূলি রঙিন মাচা ও পাড়ায় উঠেছে আজান, এ দাওয়ায় বসে ভাবি দুনিয়া আমার মেহমান। এখনো পরীক্ষা চায় আগুন সমাজ, এ মাটি আমারও মাটি, সে কথা সবার সামনে কিভাবে প্রমাণ করব আজ।
Shankar's protagonist is not representative. This is not evidentiary, it's a literary representation of a desire. She is no part of the large and ceaseless number of asylum seekers and labor for export that is produced by our conjuncture. She is not looking for citizenship as a protection rather than a set of rights within a collectivity, but claiming citizenship as the world's host. This is the big picture of democracy. The claiming citizenship as the Dunia Amar Mehman, claiming citizenship as the world's host, reclaiming the ordinary, experience of the impossible in the literary, the very paradox of democracy. I end with a few passages from a reading of Pterodactyl, which will be forthcoming, because I want you to tell me if in my critical reading today, learning and unlearning from mistakes has come to make its nest. Pterodactyl is a novella by Mahasweta Devi. A prehistoric bird has appeared in a remote tribal area. A sensitive male journalist, leaving behind an outstanding female partner, comes to investigate. This framing is important. He's transformed by his experience there. Here now are excerpts from my recent essay, just a few, forthcoming in a Routledge collection. The reader can know she is in Chhattisgarh. It's we should have had the little map, Surya, we forgot. Because it's a very important place. Arundhati Roy has written that famous essay, because Mahashita cunningly mentions Abujmar in the middle of the text, which is an actual place, of course. But only if you're reading carefully, you will know. It's right in the middle. I quote, in Abujmar, there is a huge depression in the rock, like a well or like a monster's bowl. The sunlight never reaches its belly fully. The Adivasis live in the land of that primordial dusk. She does not focus on what we know best about Chhattisgarh, the so-called Maoist struggles inspired by middle-class leaders, but rather what Simon Gikandi has described as the ordinary. Frame and fable together stage the absolute separation of middle-class activist life and Adivasis in remote enclaves that still exist in India, and certainly in Abujmar. Let us remember as we enter the text, I quote, Puran has come to Pitha with the worry that Saraswati, that wonderful woman, very ethical, might leave someday. From small town middle-class family life, we enter, so that frame is at work while we are moving into Abujmar. Small town middle-class family life, we enter the world of the lower reaches of the state civil service in a remote rural area where shreds of top-down idealism still survive. And I'll tell students and faculty here who know something about the civil service in India that the BDOs, the block development officers, because it's their first job, they do indeed still quite often carry a certain kind of idealism, which Rosa Luxemburg style one really can use. We see this as they encounter the still feudal functionaries of local self-government. Panchayat, by contrast, is still feudal, the Sarpanch and his cohorts. But this too is a frame. An indication of what will be held within this is given in two passages. The first, I quote, the survey map of Pitha block is like some extinct animal of Gondwana land. The beast has fallen on its face. The new era of the history of the world began when, at the end of the Mesozoic era, India broke off from the main mass of Gondwana land. It is as if some prehistoric creature had fallen on its face then. Such are the survey lines of Pitha block. There is a perfectly reasonable discussion of, quote, development needs in terms of that map. I quote, look at this map. Near the foot of the animal, there is a church, but no missionaries. We are 40 kilometers to the south of this church, and a canal would have gone from the animal's tail to its head by the Madhopura irrigation scheme. The scheme is in the register. That canal would have joined the Pitha River as well. And look here, I'm looking. The tribals are in the animal's jaws. Near the throat, water gushes down into Pitha at great speed in the rainy season. If there were small dams 3 miles down the river and then another mile down, the tribal area of Pitha would be green. And of course, all the monies have been sanctioned and stolen. So, but they're talking, the good guys are talking in terms of the map as real. But the map is that Mesozoic animal. The second passage, a boy painted this on the stone wall of his room. The picture was taken by Shrut Pratap, but no, this photo is not for a newspaper, not for publicity. He did not print a photo. No, we took away the negative. He cannot print this. He doesn't have a copy. What is it? Bird? Webbed wings like a bat and a body like a giant iguana and 4 legs, a toothless, gaping, horrible mouth. But this is, don't say it. I won't hear it. the prehistoric Mesozoic animal from a time and space that intervene in the opening of the journey into the true fable. There are two unrealities in the telling of the journey or the fable. One of them is Shankar, the only literate person in the community, almost silent throughout the text until he breaks into the philosophical discourse which refuses the interference of so-called, quote, development. So Shankar, somewhat unrealistically, is given the right, the first right, the right to refuse, which is something that I say to the superpower so-called helpers constantly, that that is the first right that you must honor, the right to refuse. What is it to help? So what is Shankar Nagesya saying? A warning bell goes off in Puran's mind. He must understand Shankar's words. Otherwise, no justice can be done to himself or Saraswati. Shankar speaks as if he's singing a saga. Shankar comes up close and says, can you move far away? To the activists, very far, very, very far. Shankar sways, he faints, only a dusky waiting without end. What news does it want to give? This is the pterodactyl. And you know, this singing like a saga, this can be heard. I mean, I'm being evidentiary now. I have myself heard this, Lotu Shabor, Itihash Bolchi. So this is, Mahashita takes this but changes it around. And then Mahashita offers the distinction between extinction by planetarity and anthropocentric extinction, as imagined by Puran, the journalist, trying to, quote, read what the pterodactyl's message might be. And reading here is the actual robust model of reading, trying to enter the other's space and speak as the text. This is a right, a prayer to be haunted by the text, so that it is as if the text speaks by me, not really through me, but by me. So to an extent, those are the distinction. One is extinction by planetarity. That's the limit of our power. Whatever we do will be gone. But the other is the anthropocentric extinction, where so it's a distinction in deconstruction between event and task. The first sentence is about planetarity, the rest about our responsibility for killing our Earth. Please allow me a long quotation, and that's the end. So, and it will be up there, yes. And you have the Bengali, right?
Yeah.
We are extinct. Puran is imagining the bird speaking. We are extinct by the inevitable natural geological evolution. That's planetarity. You too are endangered. Puran thinks the bird is saying, but it's silent, gray, lidless eyes. You too will become extinct in nuclear explosions or in war or in the aggressive advance of the strong obliterating the weak, which finally turns you naked, barbaric, primitive. Are you going forward or back? Think. Forests extinct, animal life obliterated outside of zoos and forest sanctuaries. What will you finally grow in the soil, having murdered nature in the application of man-imposed technology? Deadly DDT greens, and then he puts a quote in there. Those of you who know Voloshino's idea of reported speech as genre, literary descriptions, think about the use of quotes here. Deadly DDT greens, charnel house vegetables, uprooted astonished onions, radioactive potatoes, explosive bean pods, monstrous and misshapen spastic gourds, eggplants with mobile tails, bloodthirsty octopus creepers, animal blood-filled tomatoes. The national spirit, end of quote, the national spirit of the ancient nations is crushed like nature, like the sustaining earth. Their sustaining ancient civilizations received no respect. Recognition didn't happen. They were only destroyed. They're being destroyed. Is this what you're informing us? The gray lidless eyes do not answer. Have you come up from the past to warn? Are you telling us that this man-made poverty and famine are crimes? This widespread thirst is a crime. It is a crime to take away the forest and make the forest-dwelling peoples naked and endangered. Are you telling us that it is a crime to strangle and destroy all voices of protest and the arm of combat? And of course, Puran is describing, quote, development. The eye utters no word. How gray, what amazing eyes. It wants to say something, to give some news. Puran does not understand. No communication point, no word can be said or written. Is there a message in the smell of its body? Why do its eyes look? In the inner shrine room, the worshipped and the worshipper are gone, of the family of a poor tribal who is dead. O ancient one, sitting unmoving, what do you want us to know? The gray eye does not answer. You have come to me for shelter, and I don't know how to save you. Is that why I'll see your death? I don't know. If I knew, I could have saved you. You would have taken wing and left again. You would have searched and found water, food, shelter. I don't know. You see, this is the staging of not knowing, making a mistake, not having the answer, trying to say something, not knowing if it's right or wrong. If I knew, in this shrine room of stone and earth in the last years of the century, an urgent piece of news that humanity needed to know came to us, and the news could not be given because human beings did not know or understand its language. The gray eye wants to give Puran some news. Critics such as Bruno Latour, Timothy Morton, Margaret Cohen, and Amitav Ghosh have suggested that the rise of the novel, conventionally connected to modernity, can be reconstellated today as connecting to the Anthropocene and the climate change that is bringing the world to its own destruction. Jennifer Wenzel, Jessie Oak Taylor, Ursula Heise, Sadia Abbas, and others have taken issue with these writers, writes Thangam Ravindranathan. She suggests that this criticism of the novel, I quote Ravindranathan, at the same time imagines the epilogue, the final twist to a long story about ultimately deceived reading. This story's end would read, she writes, human literature turned out in the end to be carbon emissions, uncannily clever gesture of self-protection. It is in complicity with this deceived reading that I add my appeal for a more robust practice of reading, harnessing the humanities for the kind of imaginative activism holding back from planetarity that Mahasweta stages in Pterodactyl. What I'm proposing through the practice of literary reading is a training of our students' habit of, quote, normality, continuing through further teaching and rearing, developing a worldwide collectivity, generation by generation, rearranging the ground level affect of greed and parochiality at all ends, capitalism and identitarianism, greed and parochiality. I want to be able to say, without accusations of sermonizing, that Pterodactyl can become a teaching text for such a practice of literary reading. I have tried to show how the text throws the reader structural and textural signals for reading, finally limited by planetarity. For the planet is in the species of alterity, belonging to another system, and yet we inhabit it on loan. It is not really amenable to a neat contrast with the globe. The pterodactyl is brought alive from that space through the map. The survey map of Pitta block is like some extinct animal of Gondwana land and is meticulously rewritten back into the visual representation of the map in the end. Look at the description of the death. The prehistoric animal is restored to the map. The body seems slowly to sink down, a body crumbling on its 4 feet, going down, just like that flat map. The head on the floor. In front of their eyes, the body suddenly begins to tremble steadily. It trembles, and suddenly the wings open and they go back in repose. This pain is intolerable to the eye. Bhikhya goes on saying something in a soundless mumble, moving his lips. He sways, he mumbles, sways forward and back. About an hour later, Puran says, gone. Now it is as it was when all of the top-down workers saw it and discussed development in terms of the animal. The planetary is restored as it can be done in didactic literary space, but of course not in our practical everyday to the worldly. The planetary is reduced, is restored to the worldly. Nothing works if you do not know the limit of your powers. That is the planetary. It is to supplement top-down philanthropy with the impossible task of harnessing the humanities robustly into education. Puran, in Mahasweta's narrative, Puran's lack of understanding is given to us transformed as another improbability, if not impossibility. Puran, the caste Hindu activist, following Shankar, the subaltern activist's behest, and not writing a report for his paper. If I may say it with utmost respect and indeed affectionate devotion, Mahasweta could not do this in life, but the imagination took her further. Yet the report is written in the text, and the rhetoric is of a letter not sent, except in fiction, to every reader, all of you, as she animates the text in the existential temporality of reading. What can come of such readings? I have offered you one example. The literary offers no guarantees, perhaps at least an acknowledgement that the first right of those we want to help is the right to refuse, a further acknowledgement that nothing can change without a total epistemological transformation of the state, a call for the humanities beyond the disciplines, an acknowledgement of our limits which makes practice stronger. You will add to these possibilities, I hope. In summary, a move from the confidence of the essay on the prelude to the reading of Pterodactyl. Marxism changes from ideology critique through epistemology into accessibility to the subaltern. Deconstruction thickens into the politics of planetarity, a formula: do not accuse, do not excuse, earn critical intimacy, locate the moment of transgression, inhabit it, and turn it around for use. I must be gentlest with gendered subalternity in order to earn a response. Two teaching texts, Condé and Mahasweta, to insert the top and the bottom into the intuitions of democracy, that democracy of spirit must pre-exist the democratic structure, and that democracy is the contradiction of ipseity by alterity and vice versa. You and I must learn to learn from mistakes. Literature can help, but what is staged there cannot be possibilized. And my question to you, will this fly? Thank you.
Gayatri, thank you so much for this talk. So much to consider here, and I loved your retrospective on so many of your works and talking about your change of mind and having a way of thinking about what it means to change our minds and be willing to have our minds changed. I will remind everyone that they can drop a question into Q&A, and we do have a couple of questions that are here already. Mary Beth Rose, who is a beloved colleague and friend of mine, and former director of the Institute for the Humanities, gave me a question that so perfectly connected with a question that was brewing in my head that we decided we would roll them all into one. And that is, what are your thoughts about what constitutes a successful reading of a work, given the importance of realizing our mistakes and given almost the thematic, you might say, of mistakenness in the way that we should approach reading literary texts or political situations? When do we feel like we've been successful in accounting for such a situation or a text? And you said, as we prepared, that you would like to take a couple of questions at a time. Is that what you'd like to do?
Yes, three
Okay.
if possible.
Okay. Well, we have two so far. here's one that has just come up. Great talk as always, thank you. I appreciate the framing of attempting to be a servant to the subaltern, as I often struggle with the questions of agency and power when working with subaltern communities. In contemporary times, refugees and migrants are perhaps the emergent subalterns, and I would like to pick your beautiful brain for what a subaltern pedagogy would look like. What can we and the system do to include and allow refugees to inhabit educational spaces that are not built to include and support them?
Great question. Is there another one?
Well, I have a question myself, which is not really a question, but maybe for you to expand a little bit on what you mean by having education consist of inhabiting the paradox of democracy. I think that's such an intriguing notion, and I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on what you mean by that.
Yes, okay, I'll go for these three. Now, what constitutes a successful reading? You see, when I'm reading, I'm really not thinking of, is it success? What is successful there? I mean, is the reading correct? Is that the question? Are we approaching what the text wants to do? I don't really think that in the case, I mean, it's hard to give that one up, but I think in the case of the literary, the person who is reading, the success of that person is not at issue. I think it's hard to teach this to students also, to suspend that one. And you know, this, when I was teaching with the mathematician this last semester, the semester before last, he found this so menacing because he was understanding this so that, you know, he forgot that we were team teaching and you don't just undermine the other teacher, you know what I mean? He just jumped. Surya was in the class, he will tell you that I'm telling the truth. From within the discipline, he disciplinarized the question, and he assured the students that he was taught and he would never ever suspend judgment. As if I was telling the students that they would suspend judgment, they should suspend judgment in everything they do in life. Not at all. I think it's extremely important to be able not just to give opinions, but to judge. But I do feel that to an extent, the experience with the suspension in literature actually prepares that. So I would, I mean, so what do you grade for? What I do quite often grade for is how much they are, because that's a criterion of judgment. After all, we write recommendations, we give grades. So I look at how much they're looking at signals in the text. You know, you will notice in that thing, in that prelude essay, I mean, I was looking at it and I was realizing how well I had been taught to read, that, you know, there were those two words in a certain line, which the way in which the line has been written, it could describe both the outside, both what's happening in the atmosphere, and the inside, what's happening to the poet. And in that uncertainty, he's able to make certain kinds of claims. So that's a signal that's being thrown out by the text. And so I quite often, when I judge as a teacher, classroom teacher, I will judge in this way to see how much the reader is not going, I think this and therefore, so that the text proves his or her topic sentence. I know that that's the miserable way in which they're taught to write with a topic sentence and then proof, etc. But I kind of undo that one too. So I would say that in my book, the literary is where you suspend judgment, you resist the desire to judge in order to see if you can't. See, that's what the whole section where Puran is imagining the pterodactyl. The pterodactyl doesn't say anything. Puran is reading. He's reading. It's the text doesn't say anything. I mean, there's Plato's Republic. But so therefore it's a wonderful question which we must continue to ask. That's why right at the end I asked, will this fly? It's the other person to an extent who will see me reading and say, what? That she's good? What does it mean? I don't know. What the hell is this? How does one turn off the thing? Oh God, it's my doctor. Shabash. Just a minute. Dr. Beer.
Yeah, hi.
I'm in the middle of a Zoom meeting with Chicago, Dr. Beer.
Oh, now, okay. So call me back a little bit later, all right?
I will do so.
Is this your home number?
This is my home number. Thank
call
you.
Me back anytime,
I certainly will. I certainly will. Bye. Okay. So something, I'll go to the second question. But I was talking at Hitotsubashi University in 2007, and thousands, I swear, thousands had come. And so I've lost some. I've got only 93 now, sadness. But the thing is that, and then in the middle of it, my sister rings because my sister's daughter has just given birth, okay? And so I can't not take that call. And so, but I was told that there is still a story that I had arranged for that interruption, because of course they couldn't understand what I said to my sister in Bengali, right? So that I had actually arranged for that thing. So the doctor's call is a bit like that. So let's go to the next one. It's a very wonderful question. And of course, refugees can, you see, at subaltern, I don't really know who, this is one of the problems of a webinar, I don't know to whom I'm speaking, but the subaltern is just the name of a position, right? And so it's like somebody, for Gramsci, the definition is small groups in the margins of history. Margins of history, in other words, history is not made considering them. And this is so true, you will read books, and because I have spent so much time since 1987 in these schools, right? Teaching and training. I mean, people say I support them. I don't support them like I don't support Columbia. It's just, I do give the salary, but that's kind of settling ancestral debts. I mean, I'm a Brahmin. For thousands of years, we've screwed these people. So that's hardly helping. So to an extent, I mean, it's repaying ancestral debts, if you like. But because I've been with them, taking them seriously, teaching, training, learning from them, saying, tell me how I can get through, etc., etc. But that I can see that book is that book that's being written, and I will not name these books. They have not really spent any real time, maybe some ethnographic type time, real time below the largest sector of the electorate. And so their generalizations are wrong. So therefore, this business of who becomes subalternized, this is groups, I mean, in their own way, the 99% occupy Wall Street. They were subalternized. That's what they didn't like, right? Antigone was a princess. She was subalternized. So yes, indeed, refugees can be thought of as subaltern insofar as they have no access to any kind of real civil rights, etc. So, I mean, the word subaltern should be used only in these kinds of contexts that you are talking about. It's not a word that describes people who are feeling inferior and so on and so forth. No. Yes, refugees, of course, and yes, migrants, of course. But what kind of migrants? That you have to look at the subalternization of migrants, and indeed there are a very large category of subalternized folks today. And so and I would like to bring in here Rohingyas. You see, they are to an extent today the classic subalterns. I mean, stateless in a very peculiar way because they lived in that Arakan area, mountains and seas and all kinds of borders and so on, before one could think nation state. And then as nation state began to happen, the bombers began to think of them as interlopers. And finally, after the 60s, when everyone was kicked out, they were defined as immigrants. Imagine that. And then, I mean, I think about crossing on foot from Tijuana into San Diego. Who created that border? How did it happen? So that to an extent, yes, it is indeed that kind of, I've written about this in terms of India and Bangladesh walking along the border. So subalternization happens. It's a phenomenon that we should look at rather than, and so you're absolutely correct in asking this question. As for agency and power, you use your agency and power, but tell them that, I mean, this morning, very early, about 1:30 in the morning, I had a conversation with Ujjwal Lohar, okay? A guy, I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but in fact, I'm not going to tell you the story at all. But I was saying to him, Ujjwal, but what you have to remember, Ujjwal, that everyone in Calcutta High Court is doing this for you because at every step, I'm making a request to the senior advocate and I'm making a request and I'm immediately giving money. But you know what we want. You're being insulted here, Ujjwal. They don't think of you as a citizen of India and they're just, it's because of me. But Ujjwal, it shouldn't happen like this. That's what we are trying for. So that's what you must really think about. How can it happen, Ujjwal? So to an extent, and of course they have to think collectively. I was only talking to him alone on the cell phone at 1:30 in the morning. But this idea, you use it, you have agency, use it. You're not going to give voice. I mean, that is genuinely a mistake. Everything you've said is wonderful. It's a real problem. And you're absolutely correct. But who the hell are we to give voice? We use privileges that we have for other kinds of reasons. And sometimes we're very bold. This too I am. And we are actually able to gain some more privilege because of what we are doing, which they can't do. But this is a mistake. And you tell them that we are trying to work for a time when I will not be needed like this, so that they know that the agency and power that you have is not a good thing. It's part of the terribleness of the state, rather than you giving them agency and power, because you can't give them agency and power. You yourself are also played by globalized capital. You're subsumed, you're outside in the funding machine. So therefore, you don't have as much agency and power that you think you have. Anyway, and as for inhabiting the paradox of democracy, why? Because these are the largest sectors of the electorate. That's why. You can't teach them all, because this kind of teaching, like athletics, can only be done. I teach these people exactly with the same focus as the students at Columbia. You cannot, I mean, when I hear about education, I've opened a school, I have to laugh, because there is no even capacity to examine the quality of education because of the cognitively damaged folks who are learning. And so you've opened your schools, very, very nice. I've also opened a coffee house. So therefore, because they're the largest sector of the electorate, and it's the hardest for this largest sector to be focused towards other people when you're that poor. On the other hand, if you're voting, you have to be focused towards the other people. And because these people are not taught about what it is to vote, therefore they bring in tyrants, because all they know is the whole feudal dispensation of people giving them things. I mean, I'm just coming from the schools, right? And thanks to I should thank you and say in public that you gave a benefit for my schools by buying very nice tickets all the way to my schools, which after all, you were not obliged to buy. But that's what I said right at the beginning, that's what it's a benefit. And I told them that too. So my thanks. So therefore, I'm just coming, right? And I saw, because it's just before the elections, right? I saw that in the villages, everybody is vaccinated. Why? For votes. So to an extent, and then there is incredible violence. Also, I'm going to vote 10 times. I'll see anybody doing anything to me, I'll harm their family. Okay, now, I don't read this in newspapers. I know the people. So therefore, to an extent, it is necessary for the children to get the habits that lead to this kind of other directedness, even when they have nothing. This kind of refusal of leaderism, because read Fanon. Fanon uses the word leader in English. He knew what he was talking about. You read it, you think he's describing any one of these: Turkey, Philippines, India, the United States, the leaders, as I say, Rakush Rajas, monstrous leaders. So that's why they have to be. The paradox of democracy is the basis, and the literary going towards the other. That's I'm trying to want to inhabit the other. That is practice for this kind of other directed behavior. Democracy is not a joke. It's citizenship is the structured part of it, but the fuzziness that I was talking about, that's not a joke. And so it's so wonderful. Myanmar, they are now they're in a position where they're not afraid of death. And in Thailand, they're in a position where they are really, something is happening there so that the monarchy is shaking. So these kinds of places, these places are behaving, Tunis behaved like that because of long history of oppression. The general strikes that Rosa Luxemburg describes. But that's not how they should learn. How they should learn is normally, in classrooms. No more questions? Goodbye. It's okay. I don't mind not having questions.
I had muted myself. We have a couple more questions if you're willing to take them.
Yeah, I don't mind.
Okay.
Except, of course, my doctor is waiting. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
No, don't worry about it.
All right. Are you sure?
Yeah,
all right.
He's not supposed to call now.
Okay.
He's a Columbia graduate, undergraduate, by the way.
Okay. Well, that makes him a particularly interested party in preserving your health.
Yes, in fact. He's told me, because there is this triage thing in so that, if you get a stroke and you're an old person, they do minimal stuff, whereas a younger person gets much more. And I made him swear. I said, look, Dr. Beer, If I get a stroke, you know me, and you know how hard I work for others, and people are still dependent on me. They are asking me to do this and that and that thing. You give me the full treatment, okay? That's a promise. I just reminded him again. He said, yeah, that's
Okay.
it. I haven't forgotten.
I'll call him and say the same thing if need be.
You do that.
I'll vouch for that.
I told Surya I'll get some recommendation letters from Anirban, from yourself, so that I've written enough recommendation letters for you folks. Now you have to write for me. Anyway, carry on.
So we have a question from Vivek Pandey.
Yes.
My question is about the paradox of democracy and the arithmetic equality you mentioned. Is there a way for someone to really inhabit the paradoxes when they are not even an arithmetic equal? I am thinking through my own position as being in a foreign country and not having the opportunity to regain this equality by going back to my own nation.
Okay.
And then there's another question that begins, I genuinely am in love with you. For someone who has recently been enamored by postcolonialism and subaltern studies, I am struggling to find the appropriate place to start. Where should one start, and what resources should we be looking at to start out?
Okay. Is there another one? Nobody else. Okay, what's in chat?
Oh, yes. Okay. No, we have quite a few more that suddenly came in. So I wanted to ask not so much a question, but if you can expand on the idea of the meta-psychological and the psychological.
That's a very fine question. Thank you. I mean, it's not, of course, a question, but yes, just as you asked me to talk about the paradox. Okay, Vivek, you know, Pandey, actually. Pandey, not Pandi.
Okay.
I'm telling you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and in fact, of course, Vivek, as you well know, at home, you perhaps don't know, but we say Pandey, Pandey, Pandeyji. Anyway, so I'm not going to descend into that. But at any rate, Vivek, let me tell you, yes, to be living somewhere where you're not a citizen, and first of all, one should not take, you know, because it's a very serious and important question, I'm trying to be as serious as possible. Now, you can't go back to it's not your own nation, you're saying. Now, one of the things that I'm very careful about is this own nation business, okay? Now, you're not here unwillingly, are you? You're not restrained. I mean, the reason why you don't go back is perhaps at this point, excuse me if I'm insulting you, but perhaps at this point, money or COVID or stuff like this. Be very serious and honest with yourself. You're not here against your wishes. So one must not, remember how I said, I don't want people to think that the fact that I live here is my problem. My real problem is with being very upper caste at home. So to an extent, you know, Pandey is also a Brahmin name. So to an extent, what you have to always look below rather than be sorry for yourself, always look below, because historically, Vivek, that name has received, whatever class position you're in now, perhaps as a graduate student, temporarily not very well endowed. I don't know who you are, so I'm just assuming from your question, whatever that is, historically, you should actually look below and don't think of so-called national identity as my own. The intellectual's obligation is to be constructively critical. I'm very critical of the Republic of India, and yet I have kept my passport for this long so that I can vote there. Yeah, I've lived here for 60 years. I still have my passport, so I can vote. And you want to vote. Very good. So, but therefore, and in the country where you're living, your country of residence, I'm also very critical of the United States. But I'm a New Yorker. You know, that picture that you're looking at is the picture of the Hudson River. You know, the open river is just beyond, but right 1 block from my house, I walked there. I took this picture from one of those stones. The Hudson makes this beauty for me. Okay, so it's not something that I don't love. Therefore, one must learn to love. Land does not belong to anyone. We are all living on the earth on holiday. The earth was not named. So this own nation thing, question that one. You know, and you must learn language as well and try to love where you live, because nation is not the only reason you love. And here, for example, I have not voted, I can't vote by choice, but I feel that by giving this kind of education to my students here, thousands of students now, and since you are in this room, you are related with the teaching world in some way. I have voted. I've voted 1,000 times. So therefore, it's this kind of feeling, Vivek, question it and look below and don't feel just sorry for yourself. Feeling sorry for yourself is not ever going to be productive. You can feel enraged because you've been put in a certain position, but you don't sound like you've been put in that position. It's not an enforced exile, and you're not here unwillingly. So therefore, one more thing, my mother, when she was brought in 1972 by my brother, because he needed someone, first of all, I think he must have felt he wanted to protect her, although God knows she didn't need protection. But she came and she became a citizen, right? And so when she saw that my mother, born in 1913, not exactly a young person, when she saw that she had changed civil society, I mean, she had a passport, she said, well, I should do something. I'm a citizen. And so in her late 70s and 80s, she gave more than 10,000 hours of voluntary labor for PTSD, Vietnam War veterans. You know, rather than just sit at home and be my nation and cook meals so that people could have South Asian food. No, sir. She behaved like an American citizen. My mother, who certainly also loved India as much as she could. So therefore, you just think about these things. I wish I could see you and talk to you in person, but that would be my answer. And the second one, you know, you can only love me, you know, because love is a slightly insulting word when you don't know the person, and she's female and she's old and she's, you know, no longer in the commodified sexual marketplace. There is, think about this, okay? So, you know, to a feminist woman, I don't know anything about you at all. Thank you for saying you love me, but love is harder. And in my generation, love is just a 4-letter word. So you keep that word away from Gayatri Spivak. I would want, that's cheap love. I would want some other kind of earned feeling. Okay, I don't know you yet. As to where should you start now? The best way to start is by following through. I mean, I presume you are a scholarly person. I can't tell you how to start in another way, because I do deal with people who have had no education at all, but you're in this webinar, so therefore I presume that's not how I should speak to you. So I would say that the way to start is, whatever you're reading, start following through on the documentation. And it is going to following through in the documentation as much as possible in the original language. I'm still learning Chinese. You know, it's a fantastic thing to learn languages so that you can enter into lingual memory. I have said about the post-colonial stuff that otherwise what happens is that those who were colonized, do a kind of emotional blackmail, because of course they have their native languages and they hold it over the heads of other kinds of students, other kinds of scholars. So I would, since I don't know you, I don't know your background at all, generally speaking, I can only give this kind of advice to students I take the trouble to know well in terms of where they are, like going towards them. Ask Surya how much I still have to try to enter into the way in which he thinks about teaching, for example. So therefore, I would say, just offhand, try to follow through whatever you're reading, try to follow through in the documentation, and as much as possible in the original languages. And you know, one can really start anywhere if the attitude is that prayer to be haunted rather than I love Gayatri Spivak and I love Poco, etc. That's, you know, I don't love Poco at all. In fact, I wrote a long book called Critique of Postcolonial Reason, but because people are racists and they don't read, they have decided that I must be a postcolonial critic. Whereas I wrote very strongly a critique of how metropolitan folks use so-called postcoloniality, and they have no idea of what postcolonial nations are really like. Therefore, I myself don't love anything. Or if I do, I'm certainly not going to tell you in a webinar. I could certainly say that I love Bengali food. That's unfortunately, that's what I was brought up on. I've learned to love many other kinds of food because I think it's a bad idea to only like what you were brought up on. But God damn it, I go home and I just melt into a little pot. So of course, these days, no one cooks for me because I live in this apartment. But anyway, that's my answer for you. As for meta psychological, see, the meta-psychological is the machine. See, this is a very, well, now, first philosophies think about where human beings come from. So one of the, and this is true everywhere, people generally in this country, they talk about the Greeks, but it's not just the Greeks. So the first philosophies think about, and therefore one of their ideas is body-mind. That's one of the hugest problems. How can bodies have minds? And how much is mind? And what happens to mind? And what is the relationship? It's a body-mind relationship is one of the biggest. Now, Freud is in that line, first philosophy, right? So he actually does try to think about how they cross. And he's that, and he's also within German classical philosophy, which Marx and Freud, both of them have what it's very difficult, you know, if you take the phrase structure of feeling, Raymond Williams, it's very difficult for the general, I mean, I'm generalizing, and whenever one generalizes, it's existentially impoverished, but nonetheless, one must generalize. So generalizing for the British structure of feeling, it's very hard to catch this particular element in German classical philosophy, which is the mechanical intuition of the mind, that it is a whole structure, like Anlage, programmed, this thing moves, tick-tock, something else rises, etc., etc. But so therefore, even from the 18th century on down, they have not been able to translate Kant properly. Marx also suffers. But at any rate, so Freud, as he's working, he is looking at the machine, the whole mechanical structure of the mind, the mental machine, what he calls the soul. That particular thing has an area of production which is not accessible to individual psychology. It's not psychological. You can't know it. It produces you. You know, it's if one wants to be very natural, very simple, you know, I'm sitting here talking to all of you. A terminal disease may be working away. You know, I have, what's it called? Atrial fibrillation. Right? Now, God knows what's happening in that one. You know, I can't know. It's my heart, but I can't really know because, you know, I don't feel anything, but some damn thing is happening. So, you know, the body is also manufacturing with so many tiny, millions of tiny movements are going on. And it looks like I'm calm, nicely wearing a sari with a chira, and I'm talking slowly in English, sitting in front of a river, nice and smiling, etc. But in fact, all of this meta-psychological stuff is producing me. I'm talking in terms of the body, but what Freud is saying is that there is, in fact, something in where the distinction between mind and body is kind of questioned. And of course, what is his name for that something? It's drive, trieb. And how do this already, my point, how does the standard edition translate it? Instinct. It's completely wrong translation. So if you read the Freud, you're reading along only English, you know, no German, etc., pacha, 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 and you're reading all this about instincts, first of all, it'll seem contradictory and wrong. And second of all, you will not understand that Freud is talking about these drives, which are non-specular because they are not accessible to the mind. They're slowly, it will come, the mind will be generated. The metapsychological sometimes comes through in analysis if you're having a bad time. So it's not the topology of the mind. There is something, so which is not accessible to my individual psychology. And so this is now, I think of Freud not in the sort of scientific claims. We all know that that's a little doubtful, but in the you know, like successful, it's not. But what we are thinking about really is in terms of the long tradition of parabolic, parable tradition of taking narrative as ethical instantiation. And the narrative is created between two people in Freud's case, which is really very fantastic. And so therefore, within that mind-body problem situation, within that idea of the mind, my mind being produced by a kind of mechanical arrangement where in the borders, the definition of mind and body begin to become somewhat blurred. That's the idea of the metapsychological. So, and what I have said quite a lot of times is that when the computer came into being, we had an empirical representation of the metapsychological in programming, which produces, and also hardware, which produces the software with which then we can produce a different order of meaning in one way or another. I hope this is a satisfactory answer. Generally speaking, it's better if one has a text to look at, but at this point I have the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, but I think it would take right here, but it would take too long. It's in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, chapter 5, by the way, when he goes away from the you know, trauma to him is boring. He's like, okay, yeah, pleasure principle, human beings take care of trauma, so what? I want to go beyond that thing. Then he begins to go into the post-human and the pre-human animals and so on and so forth. And that's where he also begins to talk about the metapsychological as metaphorized as the death drive. That's a different thing. I mean, I'm not going to go into that because that's a much bigger philosophical thing. Normality is a glitch in the death drive. But that's bigger than what I was just describing, the topological psyche. but it's a fantastic, fantastic topic. Thank you for asking for that one.
We are going way over time, Professor Spivak, and I'm wondering if perhaps I could just save some of these questions for us to pursue tomorrow. I know that at least a couple of people who ask questions are going to be at our seminar, so we can take these up tomorrow. I have copied them and pasted them into a document so we can be sure to bring them up. How does that sound?
For me, it's fine, but for the questioners, I hope it's fine too.
I hope that's okay. I would like to thank you so much for such a generative talk. It's definitely going to be sitting in my mind for a long time. I'm sure that everyone shares those thoughts with me. And I really look forward to continuing this discussion tomorrow at our seminar. If I think that we've had a request for joining the seminar, we do have a wait list. So if anything opens up, we will allow a couple more people in.
I have a request. I have a request.
Yes.
Please don't write me emails where you expect long email prose answers, because you see, my problem is that the Du Bois book is 11 years late and the Gramsci book is 6 years late. So my problem is finding time for writing. So it's cruel to expect me to write long email answers. Okay, so please don't. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I was talking about the seminar tomorrow.
No, I understand. People, you know, sometimes they didn't find the time because my answers were too long. So they said, I wanted to ask this question. Don't do it.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So for now, thank you, Professor Spivak. Thank you, Professor Parekh. And thank you to the audience. Be safe, be well. And if you are joining us for the seminar tomorrow, I will see you then at 3 o'clock. And for you, Gayatri and Surya, that will be
4 o'clock.
an hour later, 4 o'clock.
I will be ending a Zoom meeting with Dr. Beer. He's a very nice guy.
That's good.
Yes. So good. Bye-bye. Thank you very
Good
much.
night, everyone.
Yes,
Thank you again so much,
Yes,
Gayatri. And thank you, Surya.
Linda. It's so nice to meet you, Linda, finally. Okay.
Bye, everyone.